everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 3rd, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And for those living in the United States, happy 4th of July. For those who throw kitschy America-themed parties in other parts of the world, happy 4th of July. I hope that you guys are having a wonderful summer. I am actually about to leave for a trip with with a group at the university where I am currently doing my internship for another 2 months because I'm almost done. Woohoo! We are headed to Eswatini in Southern Africa to do some work with some mostly adolescents, but some adults, to do some psychotherapeutic intervention there. And so I'm going to be out of town for a bit, but don't you worry. I've got some episodes in the queue for you. This week is a great one, but before we dive in, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. I do this on top of my full-time job as a psychology intern, and on top of all of the other work that I do, finishing my dissertation, working on other podcasts, all that great stuff. And so it really helps me to be able to keep this train on the tracks by your support really helps me because it helps me pay my assistant. It helps me pay the editors who work on the show and do any other work around the show that we need to do. Remember, if you want to pledge your support on a per episode basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. Today's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you so much. All right. So this week I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Emily Monosson. She is a toxicologist and she's written several books, but her newest book is called Blight, Fungi and the Coming Pandemic. So we're going to talk about all things fungus, but so much more. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Emily Monosson. Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Cara, for having me on your show.
Of course. So we're going to be talking about your new book, Blight, but I also want to talk about some of your other writings and just kind of like your career in general, your interest in, let's get it out in the open right at the top. I say fungi because I had a professor once who was like obsessive about us not saying fungi. And he like drilled it into my head. How do you say it?
I say fungi or sometimes fungi or fungi. I don't.
So all of them.
And people I've interviewed say it all different ways. So
okay, cool. So we'll just be indiscriminate today. I love that. We'll just use them all. So yeah, we are going to be talking quite a bit about fungi, and the kind of its role in sickness, its role in infection, its role in so many other aspects of our lives. But before we dive into the kind of content, the subject matter, I want to know more about you. So clearly you're a science writer, but what did you study in school and how, what is because I know you're on adjunct faculty also. What do you teach?
Well, I don't teach a whole lot recently.
Gotcha.
So I was trained as a toxicologist, an environmental toxicologist. And for many years, I did some research, did some consulting, and then I taught courses in toxicology. So that's what I taught last. And then I have never really considered myself a science writer.
But you've written like 4 books.
A toxicologist who writes about science because I just can't help it.
Okay, so as a toxicologist, I mean, how is a toxicologist different than, let's say, a microbiologist or a virologist or an epidemiologist? Like, there's so many ologists out there. What does a toxicologist specifically do?
Yeah, so as a toxicologist, I studied how chemicals impact living things. So instead of studying how living things like bacteria, or depending on who you are, viruses or fungi impact living things, I focused on toxic chemicals. And so that I would say is probably the basic differences. We're all looking at the same thing, how a body responds to these kinds of entities. And they're, obviously different ways. Like we have an immune defense system for bacteria, viruses, fungi, and usually living things. And we have different kinds of defenses for toxic chemicals.
And so clearly, evolution in a toxic world, that's the primary focus of that book. What about the other books that you wrote? Like, how did your kind of writing evolve and how did you choose what to write about?
Yeah, so it was sort of a sequence. So the first book was that Evolution in Toxic World, kind of about how we have evolved these defenses to toxic chemicals, because the world has always been toxic, and then how those kind of fail if they're overloaded with the kinds of chemicals we're put out into the world today. And the end of that, there was a little bit that I wrote about human evolution, and that was kind of interesting. And so that led to the next book about the response, how living things evolve in response to the chemicals that we use, and that doesn't always serve us very well. So, like antibiotic resistant microbes evolving, or pest resistance, or weeds becoming resistant to herbicides. So that book focused on those sorts of things.
And I love that you called it unnatural selection because on the other show that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide, I often argue that I don't like using the term natural selection for things like antibiotic resistance. I know it's a selection process that follows Darwinian principles, but it wouldn't happen if not for human pressures. But it's also not artificial selection or breeding because we're not intending for it to happen. So I
Yeah,
love that you called it unnatural selection. It's like, yeah, there should be a term for this.
yeah. So that, and then that book was kind of a little bit of a downer because there were lots of problems. And I was so when I would talk about that book, people would say, "Well, so what do we do about this?" And I really didn't have any good response to that. And the next book became my response to that. So it was the natural defense, which is how we can use sort of evolution and ecology to manage the sort of weeds and pathogens and things that we would normally try to manage with chemicals. And so how we can get away with the chemicals and sort of think more smartly about how we manage those things. So
Right, right.
that was
So
sort of
there
the whole.
is, yeah, sort of an evolution. And then what about this jump then to fungi? Like what brought you interested in? Because it is, I mean, yes, it's all in the same kind of big bucket, but that's a pretty big turn.
Yeah, that was so actually between those two books, before I got onto the hopeful book, after I finished the Unnatural Selection, there was a series of events that had happened that made me think about fungal pathogens. So there was a time when, in the East Coast anyway, we started to experience a tomato disease called late blight. And it just kind of came on suddenly. It sort of ran up the East Coast. And this was, I think, in the 2000s. And it just like, it was at the end of the summer. And I'd never experienced anything like this, but these beautiful tomatoes just died overnight. The vines died, and you'd have these like skeletal brown leaves. And it turns out that the organism that caused that is the same kind of organism. It's called Phytophthora infestans. And it's the same thing that caused or contributed to the Irish potato famine. So it's the same thing that killed the potatoes in Ireland in the late 1800s. And so that was really interesting that it was the same kind of organism. And they behave like fungus. So that's how we got to fungus. For a long time, they were thought to be fungus, but they were really water molds. They're a completely different organism, but
Huh.
they do kind of look like fungus. They behave like fungus. They spread like fungus. And so that happened. And that was kind of a shock just to see how a crop could kind of die overnight. Not that I had a big crop, but I had a beautiful little garden. And then at the same time, around those years, a bunch of scientists had gotten together and wrote a review paper kind of calling attention to fungal pathogens across species. And so this was one of them. This is that water mold, the Phytophthora infestans, is often included with fungi just because it behaves like fungi and it's very well known. So they wrote about that and also about other kinds of fungal pathogens. And the interesting thing about the paper that they wrote that caught my attention was that it was scientists from across different disciplines. So that often doesn't happen where you've got people in medicine and in ecology and agriculture all contributing to a single paper to say, we have a common problem here. And I think that's what attracted me because I like to synthesize things. And I feel like that they were doing that. They were coming together from different fields to say, this is kind of the same problem, but it's across species. So that was when I thought this would be a great topic to write about. But it was another downer. And so I wrote the hopeful one, the natural defense book, and then more fungal pathogens came out, like Candida auris in humans. The white nose disease in bats became more apparent to those of us who live with bats in our backyard.
So it's interesting too, because I feel like there's even like right now in this moment, maybe we're sort of on the tail end of it, but The Last of Us, right? This like
Yeah.
video game turned series was this huge sci-fi integration, but kind of brought this idea of fungus really, I think, into the forefront of people's minds, probably because we're very well primed post COVID. Did you have any idea? Like, had you ever played the game, or did you know that series was coming out like while you were working
No,
on the book?
no,
No,
I
not at
hadn't
all.
played the game. Although I did for a while, because I had read a paper by insurance company that was trying. I think it was. I can't remember the name. Anyway, they did a scenario, like a worst case scenario of like how would you get kind of apocalyptic conditions, and what they had was two different crop fungi happening like in wheat and rice at the same time, global pandemic of those. And that was part of, on top of climate change and other things, that would really create massive chaos in the world. And so, there was that. The Last of Us, I have to say, has done more for raising awareness of fungal pathogens in humans than like the World Health Organization in October or something of 2022 had issued, 19 important fungal pathogens in humans. And that just was in the news for maybe a week or two. And,
Right.
you know,
But if we can see people turning into, mushroom zombies, then, and that's, I think, going to be such an important thing because, right, we raising awareness. I love it when sci-fi or fantasy or these different kind of avenues of fiction can raise awareness about scientific issues. And then it's nice to be able to go back and separate the fact from fiction and say, what in that was realistic, what in that was obviously over the top for effect. And of course, we've been talking about blight. We've been talking about fungal infections, like you mentioned. Worst case scenario that this insurance company devised is like our food supply gets sick, and then we don't have staple crops, which is a horrifying future to envision. But there is something very, I don't know, that captures the imagination about a human infection.
oh, yeah. And I might be wrong. I can't remember in Last of Us. Was that the basis for how the spores got spread was through a food crop? Is that right?
I don't remember. I know that they definitely were into like the mycelium. They really loved the idea of the
Yeah.
mycelium. And so there was a lot of like stuff happening under the ground and everything was connected and communicating. But yeah, I actually don't remember how the original, like the first spillover, whatever, the original
Yeah.
infection occurred.
I think it was
Um,
spores in like bread or something, but
Makes sense, yeah.
bread flour. But yeah,
Right.
that it was just a mashup of a lot of the worst parts of a lot of fungal pathogens, really.
Right. And so like you mentioned candida. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but you mentioned candida. A lot of women listening to the show have had candida infections, right? Like we've had yeast infections, which is a fungal infection. Some men and some, obviously non-binary people or gender non-conforming people as well. But it's such a common sort of vaginal infection. You also see it in people with immune issues like in throats and different areas. That's so common, but we're starting to see what resistant versions of it.
Absolutely. I actually don't know about that's Candida albicans usually. So that's
Okay.
a yeast that we tend to have on us. And
That
yeah,
we're
I have
always carrying.
infections and
Okay.
they're awful. And so, yeah, something enables them to start overgrowing or grow out of control. Usually that's how we get those Candida infections. And I will say I am not a physician, so I can't speak to what's happening right now with those kinds of Candida infections, whether those are resistant. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are. Uh, but yeah, the Candida I wrote about was a different member of that Candida,
Okay.
and so called Candida auris. And altogether, that group of fungi is really diverse, just like kind of all fungi. If you think of the fungal kingdom, it's staggeringly diverse. And there's a lot of diversity within Candida too. So the Candida that's making people really, really sick and potentially fatal is very different from the Candida albicans. Although
Good.
I do believe that I spoke to some physicians or read some papers that I think if that Candida gets systemic, becomes a blood infection rather than a vaginal or a
Or
mouth or
like, yeah, like
something,
skin or soft tissue.
then it can be very serious. So, but
Okay.
that's
Yeah,
something
yeah.
that's difficult for, it doesn't, I think that's often more often probably in hospitalized people.
Right, right, right. Isn't it interesting how something from the same genus can have so much diversity within it? And of course, we just call it all yeast. Like
Yeah,
it's all just yeast,
right.
but like you said, there are different species that have wildly different outcomes on human beings. So tell me a little bit more, just because like we started talking about people. We'll get back to our food supply and to all these other versions of it. But tell me a little bit more about Candida auris. So yeah, because I'm even like digging. I always do this while I'm talking to people, and it's like emerging global health threat, CDC, WHO. Like watch out, watch out,
Yeah.
watch out. Like what's going on with this?
So that is something that kind of emerged uh, like in a big way, really around 2016. It was probably around before then, but that's when CDC first started issuing warnings to those in the healthcare facilities about Candida auris. And so what happened was that nobody had diagnosed that before. It hadn't been a thing. And then in 2016, it sort of started popping up in different places around the world, which was kind of odd. And it turns out that there were like 5 different strains, or I guess they call them clades, that popped up, within a couple of years. So that itself is weird because if you think about COVID, we had really there was the COVID-19 virus, and then you could kind of trace how it evolved into the other strains, right? As time went along, then other strains evolved from that one strain. Right now, as far as anyone knows, there wasn't a one strain or type of that Candida auris. It just sort of emerged in different places at the same time as different strains of the Candida auris, if I'm up with the literature. And that was weird. And not only that, but then some of those strains were really antibiotic resistant. So some had more resistances, antifungal resistance. And so some had more resistance to different kinds of antifungals than others. So that was also weird and made it very difficult and what it did was it intended to infect people who are already compromised in some way. So people who had compromised immune systems, people who are in long-term in the hospital or in long-term care facilities. And so these are people who are already pretty sick. Then they get infected with this fungus. Then it's hard to treat. And the mortality was really pretty high. And then the last kind of weird thing with that fungus was that it was very difficult to disinfect the hospital rooms in the beginning before they really understood it after people were infected. And they would find it, in the hospital room on surfaces. So it sort of was the thing that had been worried about with COVID in the beginning, on being on stuff. This one really did get from a patient spread around the room onto stuff. I believe now that they have had several years working with it, they're better able to contain it.
This is neither here nor there, so I'm curious in like your perspective on it. But back in the day, so I'm back in school finishing my PhD now after like a whole other career. But when I first was in academia, I studied neuroscience, and I was like the cell culture technician at a lab that I worked in. So it was like a separate lab. We did electrophys on one side, and we did primary cell culture, so basically embryonic mice brain tissue, and kept a lot of incubators with a lot of active cultures going at any given time. And it was like, okay, if you get a bacterial infection, it sucks, but you can do stuff with it. You get sort of a viral infection, it sucks, but there's stuff you can do. If we got a fungal infection in the lab, it was like we were screwed. We had to throw everything out. And you had to just like bleach down the whole lab. It was like any time there was an inkling of fungus in the cultures, it was a nightmare. And that was kind of whenever we were talk about infection control and, sterile technique and everything, like fungus was the big one. And I don't think we quite had the protocols or we didn't have somebody on staff who could like identify the specific species every time. And the minute that we even started to notice it, it was like all hands on deck. Let's just throw all this stuff out. What do you think that is? Why is it the fungus is so hard to get rid of?
That is really interesting.
Okay.
And I guess it's not surprising. And again, I am not a mycologist. I just wrote about
Right.
fungus. But I would guess that it's spores. So, first of all, we were talking about yeast. Yeast don't really produce spores, they kind of clone themselves. So, we're not talking about
Okay.
this. It's not going to turn into a horror scenario with these yeasts. But a lot of other fungi produce spores. And, you just think of your bread. I don't know if you've ever, like last week, I pulled a sour cream that was in the back of my refrigerator. And it
Yeah.
had such a lawn of green on it. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I'd like to put this in the compost, but, is this stuff going to go all over the place? So I thought this was a brilliant idea. Maybe I'd wet it down and then the spores wouldn't get everywhere. Well, the minute I poured water on it, it was like there was smoke in the air. I
Oh
mean, the number of
no.
spores coming off of that sour cream was amazing and disturbing.
Yeah.
So, that's probably worst case because you probably didn't have that kind of lawn growing in your petri dishes. But, I would think that some of those fungi, if they're producing spores, you open the petri dish, the spores are going to get out. So it's probably
Mm-hmm.
harder to control. Bacteria don't really, unless you're talking about like bacillus, anthrax or those kinds of things.
Right. They
Yeast
don't
are
really,
producing
yeah.
spores.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah,
That
that
makes
would
sense.
be.
And how comfortable are you? Because I know you're not a mycologist, kind of helping us understand how fungi are different than the other microorganisms that we might be more comfortable with, and sort of like what their life cycle looks like.
Well, so one of the things that makes them really different compared to bacteria is that they are eukaryotes. So that means that we're eukaryotes. Our cells have a nucleus. We have a lot of different organelles, little bits, little parts that are working in our cells that are distinct. And so fungi have the same kind of cell structure. Bacteria don't have that. And so that's a really big difference, especially when it comes to treating them. So this is one of the big problems in the area of fungal pathology is that, we have lots of different antibiotics that treat bacterial diseases. And we know we're even though we have a lot of different classes, like different kinds of antibiotics, and a class usually means that the antibiotic is acting on a specific mechanism in the bacteria. So it's interacting with a protein or some kind of something that the bacteria needs to keep alive. And we're interfering with that with our antibiotics. So they're very different, and we can find a lot of those mechanisms that are very unlike anything we have. And so antibiotics tend not to be that toxic to us. But since we're eukaryotes and fungi are eukaryotes, there aren't that many mechanisms that are different than what our cells do that you can find or the drug developer can find in a fungus. And so the things that kill fungi tend to also harm our cells. So antifungals can also be pretty toxic or difficult to use, let's say, put it that way, compared to antibiotics. And there aren't that many of them, in part because of that, and in part probably because fungi hadn't really gotten the attention, and they really aren't typically as important as bacterial pathogens. There's just more bacterial pathogens than fungal pathogens.
Right, right. It
But
reminds me almost of like cancer treatments, right? Like they're not antifungals, but they're cytotoxins. And like, they're good because they kill cancer, but they also kill our healthy cells. And we have to be really, really careful, to not overdo it or to find just the right balance. And so, yeah, something that kills cells that are so similar to our cells, I can imagine it's hard to find just the right, again, balance.
yeah, and I think they've done, I think the newest antifungals are probably better than, the very beginning. They were notoriously back in the probably 70s, 80s were pretty toxic and difficult to use.
What's sort of interesting as we're talking about the comparison between bacteria, or the differences really between bacteria and fungus, is that one of our earliest antibiotics, penicillin,
Yeah.
was actually made from fungus, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you can imagine, I mean, so, what we didn't talk about, which I'm sure you've talked about on other shows, is that fungi are really important. I mean, they're just an important part of the world, important part of all environments. They're in the soil. They're necessary. Our environment would be a mess. We probably wouldn't be here if there wasn't for fungus. So, and they're just part of the soil community, or a lot of different plant community, whatever. And so, yeah, so that's, it's easy to imagine microbes and which include bacteria and protozoa and fungi all together in the soil, kind of throwing chemicals at each other, just to say this is my territory, or I'm eating this food, or whatever. So, one hypothesis, that's why you can get um, antibiotics from different kinds of soil microbes, is for that reason, that you're capturing those chemicals that they're making to push other ones away or kill them or whatever, or communicate with them. That's another hypothesis. So yeah, so it penicillin, it's interesting, and it's comes from a fungus.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that obviously opens up a question, which is not obviously the main topic here, but it's one that, as a toxicologist, I'm sure that, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I hope is interesting for you to speak to, which is, I think we forget sometimes that microorganisms, whether we're talking about bacteria or viruses, or in this case specifically fungi, they have all sorts of toxins that they produce for all sorts of different signaling purposes. And so it's not just the fungus itself, but there are fungal toxins that we need to be aware of too, right?
Oh yeah, well, that's why you don't eat mushrooms unless you know what you're doing.
Right. Right. So it's not just, is it the toxin that is usually the culprit here?
I can't speak to that, but I do think that it's chemicals that the fungus is producing that can be very toxic to you, just like
Okay.
eating plants with alkaloids that, if it's the wrong kind of chemical, it can be very toxic to you, similar to fungus. And yeah,
Gotcha. So a difference between eating a toxic, mushroom and getting infected by um a hardy,
pathogen.
yeah,
Yeah,
pathogen. Okay.
very different.
Okay. And most of what you write about in Blight is those pathogens themselves, and all the different kind of, not all, but like a lot of different pathogens and a lot of different, I guess, ecological niches or different species that they can infect.
Yeah, yeah. A friend of mine that read the book said it was actually more of a conservation book, because I think I spent some time writing about what we're losing in addition to what's killing them. But yeah, yeah. And I should say, so also that those fungi that are pathogens are a very small proportion of the millions of fungal species that are out there. So we're talking about, you know, the worst of the worst, and it's a small number of them, really, relative to what's out there.
Yeah, and I think it is so important. The point that you're making is a larger point that I think, as individual, whether we're talking about people who write science or people who communicate science, or even those who work in medical capacity, anytime we're interfacing with the public, I think it's important for us to make these kinds of distinctions and to talk about nuance, because it's very easy to bucket things and categorize things. Like, you see this a lot with complicated conversations around what is a drug, what is a pharmaceutical, what is an illicit drug, what is, it's like a drug is a drug is a drug, and drugs act on receptors in different parts of the body. And I feel like it's similar when we talk about bacteria or viruses or fungus. Like, there are pathogens that are harmful, but there are also a lot of, as you mentioned, beneficial microorganisms, like wildly beneficial microorganisms. And then there are neutral ones. And all of this has to do with our own kind of anthropocentric viewpoint anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've said that, there's really no bad really organism. It's sometimes we introduce them to a new host.
Right, right. Like,
Take off.
what we consider bad is bad to us. Like, that's really all there is to it. But there's a
Well,
reason it's bad, right? Because
yeah.
it's protecting itself, or it's trying to survive, or
Well, or
whatever.
it's just living. In the case of these fungi, they tend to just be living on us, or but it's not just us, because it's like you said earlier, it's crops, it's trees, it's you know wildlife.
Right. Right. And so, what were some of the, I guess, maybe we can focus in on some of those specific examples. Like we talked about Candida auris. We started by talking about, us, because people are kind of narcissistic in that way. Or like, but how
Well,
does
yeah,
it affect me?
there's a
But
reason why that's the first chapter of the book, really.
right, right. It's like, because who is reading this book? Oh, a
Yeah.
person. But of course, there are so many other organisms and so many other sort of ecological kind of so much in the ecological milieu that's affected by fungus. So I'm curious, what are some of the big ones? Especially considering blight, right? And coming pandemic. Like when we talk about pandemic, we're not just talking about people. We're talking about what this insurance company said was like their biggest fear. We're talking about a lot of different potential runaway problems. So what are some of the ones that you have your eye on right now?
As for emergent, I actually wrote about ones that have happened, but there are some that I just mentioned that are sort of taking off in different tree species. That seems to be, I think so. I should make a distinction, I guess, between fungi and agriculture, because that has been a problem probably since people started growing crops, and that's a huge, it's a whole discipline, and that really could easily be its own book. And I probably don't give enough time to the problems in crops. I write about bananas, and I write a little bit about wheat. So, but and I think I did that because I think agriculture is such a huge topic, and it's so complicated, but it's so important. It's kind of the most important, really, as you just mentioned. So, so emergent fungi in crops, there will always probably be some new fungus, and if not a new kind of fungus infecting crops, there'll be a new strain. So that's there's like a treadmill between trying to grow resistant varieties, or I write about bananas, and there's a whole story that people may or may not have heard about, the Cavendish banana and the Gros Michel banana before that, and how they changed one for the other because of a fungus. And then, of course, the Cavendish, which we all eat now, is under attack by a fungus that is threatening those bananas. And so you kind of wonder, did anyone ever learn anything from that? So that's a whole thing, is that agriculture is very important. The ones that I kind of touched me the most, I think, because I think the difference is because I can relate to the forests and wildlife because I'm out in them all the time. And I don't see the troubles in agriculture, even though they're so important. Um, so I write about the trees and about fungus that's impacting these. They're called five needle pine trees. So white pine here in the east, and then there's a bunch of different pines in the west coast, and one of them is called whitebark pine, and it is this beautiful kind of iconic tree that grows at tree line. Some of those gnarly trees that you might see, and they're dying off from this fungus that was brought here to this country about 100 years ago, but it's still a problem. And so I write about that story, and it's just interesting because the fungus that infects them is really interesting because it's called a rust fungus. And rusts, like fungi are just crazy. Like if I would have a hard time talking about the sort of different reproductive structures. So mushrooms are a reproductive structure. That's one kind, and lots of different kinds of mushrooms. But then there's all sorts of different spore producing structures that, many different kinds with long, complicated names, all throwing out different kinds of spores, and some are sexual and some are asexual and some are like super sexual. So, but the rusts have like 5 different kinds of spores. So this one, to complete a life cycle, it has to go through all these stages and send out different kinds of spores with different kinds of reproductive structures. And not only that, but many rusts, if not most of them, but I think not all, need 2 different species. So the ribes bushes to complete its life cycle. So the spores that actually infect the pines come from those ribes bushes, the berry bushes. And so that was something like to stop that. If they could break that life cycle, if they could get rid of those bushes, then they could control that white pine blister rust. And that was something they tried around the turn of the last century when this was really running through white pine and hitting the lumber trees and, trees that were worth something. So, of course, that had some money coming into it to try to control it. And one of the things was that they would have young men, and I think it was the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, do things like pull out those ribes bushes to try to control it. And it seems to have worked pretty well on the East Coast. But in the West, I think they were just too inaccessible, too many, too whatever, that they never really managed to control it. So it's still a pretty big problem out West. So just that. And, I wrote about the American chestnut because, none of us have really ever seen a big mature American chestnut because it went extinct because of a fungus. And that happened around the turn of the last century, but it happened within decades. It just ran down the East Coast and killed all the American chestnuts.
Is that common that fungal infections happen so quickly?
I think that it would depend on, so in this case, it's producing a lot of spores, and the chestnuts, if they grew really thick, then it wasn't difficult for the fungus to spread from one tree to another. Animals probably spread it too. I know that there's a fungus, it's another kind of rust fungus, I think, that's spreading through certain kinds of trees that are important in Australia. And they're very worried about those trees. They've tried to keep this fungus out, but I think it impacts, I'm going to mess this up, so I don't want to say it, but like myrtle, trees of the myrtle family or Myrtaceae or something like that. But that's a lot of different kinds of trees in Australia, and they're all susceptible to that fungus.
I was just Googling because I'd never even heard of rust fungus, right? Like it's like, oh, rust fungus. I'm like, what is that? And I'm like looking at pictures of it while we're talking. And it's literally like the first line, and yeah, wiki, whatever, but like the first line, rusts are plant diseases caused by pathogenic fungi of the order Puccineolus, previously known as Uredinellus, whatever. An estimated 168 rust genera and approximately 7,000 species are accepted. And I think we forget sometimes, like we think of animals and plants or like, blah, blah, blah. Like fungus is a kingdom. There are so many, think about everything. What is it? Kingdom, phylum, class, order. I'm trying to remember the order. There are so many different, once you get down to the species, so many different species of fungus.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And the one you're talking about, it's a blister. It's the Puccinia, I'm not sure how to say it, but that's a kind of rust that impacts wheat. And so that's like the ancient fungus stem rust, because there's one of them that causes stem rust, and that's kind of like pre-biblical times. That's when I was saying, as long as there's been agriculture, there's probably been some kind of stem rust.
Yeah. And are they called rust because they literally make the leaves look rusty? Like the plant looks like it has rust on it?
I think that is probably where it came from. I'm not sure, but when this, because like I said, the oldest one is probably the wheat one, and that does kind of have a rust color. And there was a whole story about the red god or something, or Robigus, and I can't remember the story, but there's a story about it, and it's because of the color. So yeah. But the rust in the pine trees, it's actually a gorgeous, brilliant orange that is on the ribes leaves. When you see those ribes, they're brilliant orange with the rust fungus. So
interesting. We've been talking about pathogens, specifically pathogenic fungus and its effect on trees, but also other plants. Is that what the word blight means? I'm actually really. What is the definition of the word blight? I've never known.
I'm so glad you asked that, because I did look it up one time, because I'm like, it's the title of the book, but it refers mostly to plants. But then I thought, when I'm looking it up, there's like, when we're talking about fungus that's impacting bats and fungus that's impacting frogs and maybe salamanders and other animals, there's not really a word for that except for pathogen.
Interesting.
So, maybe blight could apply to all of that. Why not? I mean,
seriously, why not? So it's just been a long-standing term in sort of like ag and ecology that we've used to describe a fungal infection in a plant, and then
yeah.
But is it specific, or is it kind of like a more general term?
That's a good question. I don't really know, and I think it's more I think it's a general
Yeah.
term, like when you say it has a blight, but
Hmm.
it does make me think fungus when I hear something has
Of
a
course.
blight. So yeah, I think it would be a general term, probably more often for some kind of fungal infection in plants.
But then when you mentioned like, we talked about humans, we talked about Candida auris, but also you mentioned like the is it called white nose?
White
The
nose
bat infection.
disease.
Yeah, white nose disease. So there are obviously fungal infections that are absolutely devastating that we see in the animal kingdom. That's the first one that comes to mind for me as well. But are there any others that like we should be pretty aware of?
Oh yeah, well there's a fungus called BD. It's a chytrid fungus, which is interesting because it's an aquatic fungus.
Huh. Okay.
Makes these little zoospores that look like sperm, and that has that's actually considered to be one of the most catastrophic fungal pathogens known. It's driven, I don't know, dozens, several dozen maybe species of frogs into extinction, and it is threatening hundreds of other species, and it is global. It's everywhere. So that is really, you want a fungal pandemic in animals that's bad. That's bad. Um, and the scary thing is that there's a cousin to that fungus, another chytrid fungus called, it causes a disease called B-sal, or it's called B-sal, because it impacts salamanders instead of frogs. And that one has been killing salamanders, I think they're fire salamanders, in Europe in the last several years. And here in the US, the Appalachian Mountain region is considered to be really uh, the center for biological diversity of salamanders. So we have a lot of different salamanders in the East Coast along the Appalachian Mountain area, I think. And so there's a lot of concern that it wouldn't be difficult for that organism to come from Europe to here on the back of a salamander that might be traded in the animal trade or something like that to bring that here. So that's actually one of the hopeful stories in the book because, or kind of hopeful, because the researchers that work on the frog fungus, the BD, are fully aware of the B-sal. Sorry for all these initials, but it's much better than using the fungus name,
Right.
um, which I can't even pronounce. So
Yeah,
those
they're
scientists
difficult.
have made a real effort to keep that fungus, the B-sal, from coming here and infecting the salamanders here because they worry it would be utterly devastating. And so they worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other conservation organisms. And a couple of years ago, the Fish and Wildlife, there's now a ban on, I think it's like 201 different salamanders from being imported into the US because those are the highest risk species that could carry that disease here because that is how it tends to travel is with the animal trade. And so that is kind of, they didn't exactly get what they wanted. They sort of wanted, a kind of health diagnostic testing or a promise that any salamander coming into the US is disease free, but that didn't happen. But that's a difficult thing when you talk about the science fiction. One of the science fiction devices, the tricorder from Star Trek, is really something a lot of people point to. Like, if we only had a tricorder like device, and I think people who are developing, um, you know, diagnostics are getting close to that kind of thing where you can quickly do a scan of DNA, identify what pathogens are there, and not only just identify a single pathogen, but maybe be able to identify lots of different pathogens without, being very invasive. Even probably years off, but we're getting closer to that kind of thing. But until we do, then animals are going to come in here with diseases. They're just too difficult to really confirm that an animal has no disease.
Yeah, and sometimes they don't have overt symptoms, or by the time they do have overt symptoms, they're like really, really sick. So, I mean, and this is obviously, yes, it's the stuff of science fiction, but it's also the stuff of like actual um, zoonotic infections, right? Is that these animals are carrying something, they get too close to another animal that would have never been exposed to this in the wild because of, yeah, markets or whatever,
Yeah, or
agriculture
well,
things.
Yeah, and pet trade or people releasing animals thinking they're doing a good thing when they're, don't want them too big for the terrarium or whatever, and they release them.
And then you end up, I'm on internship right now in South Florida, and like South Florida is such a, I know, right? It's the story of animals that should not be in the wild because like we are overrun by iguanas and Burmese pythons, and there's like parrots flying around the trees here. And yeah,
Yeah, you can
it's a
make some
lot.
money by becoming a python hunter.
Yeah, seriously. Not, no, I'm not going to quit my day job for that, but but it is a thing. I see people doing it.
Yeah.
And I'm just bringing this up because of my own personal connection to it. I have a very, very good friend who luckily she survived, but she had a very serious case of valley fever when she was young and actually had to have like, I don't know, she's like staples in her lung. She had some sort of like lung surgery because of it, because it was so invasive. Is would you consider that to be one of the more severe kind of, or I don't know, like broad widespread fungal infections that we deal with here in the US as human
Yeah.
beings?
So you are more aware of it. I probably wouldn't have heard of it if I wasn't, it's a West Coast thing because it tends to be in the desert Southwest. And yeah, that's a really important one, and it can get very bad. And it's one of the few that I think scientists think that infect people who seem to be totally healthy. So there's actually a story in there about students who went on a trip to, I think it was Mexico, doing some building project, and some came back with valley fever in the east. And it took a while for that to be diagnosed because doctors didn't suspect it. And the CDC came in and they eventually diagnosed it. But that's one that because of the changing climate and, land might get drier, might get hotter, that there are projections that valley fever will spread sort of east and north from its current location. So that's something that, yeah, could become worse in the coming years.
Interesting. And this is just straight up like it's in the soil, right? Or the like sandy kind of. So you're out there, you're breathing it in. There happen to be spores there. You breathe it into your lungs. You might get
Yeah.
infected.
Yeah,
Oof.
and that one I was never really clear. I couldn't understand where the distinction is between, because healthy, they say apparently healthy people can get it. It's probably a good amount of it is, it's in disturbed soil. So I think that's what one of the sort of things that can kick off an infection is that when the soil is disturbed. So it's not just, in the air all the time, maybe. I don't know that for sure.
Right, but that can happen like whether you disturbed it by kicking it up or driving a
Yeah.
car around or like, windstorms. Like
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, soil or sand or whatever can be disturbed naturally.
Yeah. Or fires.
Oh
That's,
gosh, yeah.
you know,
Jeez.
so yeah.
Phew. There's so there's a lot to be concerned about because of human intervention and our absolute changes to the climate and to the kind of ecological balance that we see on the planet. There's also maybe is there anything hopeful, something to be hopeful about? Or
Well, so
are we seeing I mean, are we seeing that more people are becoming aware and maybe this is a bigger topic of research than it has been in the past, or no?
Well, that remains to be seen.
Okay.
There's a lot of awareness right now because of Last of Us.
Mhm.
Whether that kind of awareness sticks around, I don't know, but it is bringing out a lot of stories like, your friend, like Valley Fever stories, or, people who get other kinds of fungal infections, or asking doctors to look for aspergillus when there seems to be some undiagnosable respiratory problem. So that kind of work that people are becoming more aware, but yeah, how we have such a short attention span, and then it's not all about humans. And we really should be worried about what happens to our crops and wildlife and forests. And if we are, then we need to think about how we move around in the world and what we do. And kind of what makes me hopeful, this is probably either cliche or trite, or I don't know the right word, but it's I spoke to a lot of scientists. It's these people working on these things. They have a real passion for this, and I'm grateful that they do because some of them will come up with solutions. Some of them will come up with better ways to prevent fungi from moving around. So that's one of the things that and like you said, awareness. So the more I have read recently that, training for young physicians might start including look for fungus. And also diagnostics are improving. So all these things, there's not just one thing. All this stuff is integrated and kind of goes together. It would have fungal infections were typically difficult to diagnose. There wasn't any fast way, and fungi are slow growing to identify them. So they would have to grow them out. You probably know that, like when, the gold standard still of doing a diagnostic for microbe in a hospital is often growing it out on a petri dish. And, if the microbe grows in 2 days, that's great. But if it takes a week, then that's a week or more that the person is still suffering from that infection. So, with DNA diagnostics, I think that these things will probably start to move more rapidly, and then maybe it would be more natural for a hospital or, an emergency room or whatever to be able to diagnose a bunch of, or send a sample for, broader diagnostics. I don't really know. I'm not in the business, but that's, you would hope that.
But there are plenty of very smart people in the business who
there are
are,
a lot of
yeah.
smart people, and as diagnostics, like what we saw with the rapid test with COVID, it came out. It's the more kind of rapid, not too expensive tests we have, the better off we'll be for detecting these things, even in trees. I mean, if you could have a rapid diagnostic in a forest, you'd be able to see what was spreading there. So it's not just for humans, and for animal trade. If you could swab a frog and see, that it was clear of the 10 worst diseases or whatever, that'd be a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I'm not trying to give you like a memory test here, so bear with me for a minute. But before I want to do like a hard left turn and talk about a book that you mentioned when we were offline before we started talking. But before I do that, I'm just curious because obviously we are here, Norton. We are here promoting Blight. I promise. With regards to your new book, Blight, Fungi in the Coming Pandemic. Is there anything that you feel like we didn't cover, or any kind of big takeaways that sort of you'd be remiss if we didn't mention before we
I think you
switch
asked some
gears?
really good questions. I think we covered a lot of
Oh,
ground,
good,
and
good.
yeah,
Okay,
I just
great.
think that it's our responsibility, to work with those or pay attention.
100%. And just, yeah, and it starts with raising awareness, reading about this stuff, talking about this stuff. So you mentioned to me, and I wasn't even aware of this, that back in 2010, you edited a volume called Motherhood, the Elephant in the Laboratory, Women Scientists Speak Out. And so I'm obsessed. I already ordered it. I'm obsessed. Tell me everything. What an important volume. So this is different women scientists telling their stories of what it means to basically
Yeah.
not be a man in the lab.
Well, it was mostly, yeah. So it was
Yeah.
stories from what was really ended up being kind of cool about that book. So it was back in the early days of the internet.
Mhm.
Um, and it was, stemmed from emails. I had sent out an email to a listserv I was on that said, I'm having a hard time and I'm a mom and I'm not working full time. And this makes me, and I put that out there because not a lot of people were writing or talking about that at that time. We all had our professional face on. And if you worked part time, you didn't let anyone know because people would think you didn't care so much about science, even though you could be fully invested. So when I did that, I got pages of emails back. And all these women were writing just to me. They didn't want to write to everybody on that listserv because they wanted to keep that to themselves. So everybody thought they were the only ones back then. So that's what the book came out of that. Like, everybody should know this. We should, share these stories. So then I solicited stories from whoever was out there who wanted to write them, and it would hit these different listservs. I could see when it hit like a physics listserv, I'd get like 5 essay things from physicists. So, and that, I include the stories, and what I was trying to figure out, so I had all these essays that I think there's 34, and I had to figure out how to organize them. And these were almost all women scientists, all PhDs. There was an engineer in there. Just talking about what the struggles they had being a mom and doing their career or going through grad school. And so what happened was it broke down I had women that I couldn't remember the first year, but I think I had a group that got their PhDs in the 70s And then, so I just organized it by decade. And then women who got the PhDs in the 80s and then the 90s and then the 2000s. And the sad thing is, there's really no difference. I mean, some of those problems that women had in the 70s, women were still having. And they're still having it now. It's mind boggling.
Yep. Yep. And it's such an important, I mean, it's like, it's sad that that you had to basically edit a volume that was specifically, but I mean, just so many things come up for me, and obviously we're not going to go there. But like, we are recording this right when the SCOTUS decision came down to like overturn affirmative action in university. It's like, it's it's there's a reason that there had to be an edited volume about these stories of women, because they're not mainstream stories, because technically or sadly in these fields we are still non-normative, we are still other. And it's I think the numbers are getting better, but we see that the numbers are getting better at the kind of earlier stages of the pipeline, right? Like in some of these fields we're having way more female graduates than male graduates in in these different specialties, but they're not holding tenure track positions. They're not in, obviously up at the higher, like sitting on the board in the boardroom and administration and things like that.
Yeah, that's that. And that was kind of true back then. There were a lot of the fields did have large proportions of women in them, but yeah, they would just. And one of the points I wanted to make was that it wasn't just about being in academia. It was about who's a scientist, who calls himself a scientist, and what you do as a scientist, and that there could be a lot of different kinds of career paths that were just as important. So, like, you've been in science journalism. I mean, I remember sitting at a table of women physicists, and one of them said something like, well, a lot of physicists are going into science communication, and that's just a tragedy. And I thought, what? Like, but she was upset that they were leaving academia. But I feel like, if you have, like, there was one woman who wrote a story, she got her PhD at Harvard, and I can't remember in what. And, she was working in the park as a naturalist, taking little kids on nature tours. And I'm like, what better way?
Right.
you know,
Right.
she's still using what she learned. She's just using it in a different way. And that was really if anyone had said, what would be a message from that book, that was my selfish message, maybe because I was that kind of person that did a lot of different things. But it was just that, there's a lot of different ways to be successful in science.
Yeah. And I hope that she still owned that. I struggled with that a lot. I left, I studied neuroscience, but I left after my master's degree. And then I worked in science journalism and science communication for like 15 years, came back to school. Now I'm getting my PhD in clinical psychology. And psychology is kind of like a weird duck in that until you went through the program and did all of your clinical hours and, the APA accredited, you can't call yourself a psychologist. It's a rule. Like you can't be a psychologist until you did all the things. But like I was a neuroscientist. I wasn't a PhD level neuroscientist, but I was doing laboratory work as a neuroscientist. I was trained in the neurosciences. And just because I went on to do psychom science, I didn't like lose my scientist label. But you almost feel like weird guilt and shame, like, oh, I can't call myself that. People are going to judge me.
Oh yeah, there was a whole section on who's a scientist, like who, do you consider yourself a scientist? Because and I feel that that's sad because we need more scientists in the world, and when we discourage people who are science oriented,
right,
from doing it because you didn't, get your PhD and become a tenured faculty. That's a problem.
Right.
That's a really
or like when somebody who is a scientist, they're just, I shouldn't even say just, they are a scientist and they're doing work that is not in academia. We shouldn't discourage them from being science. Yeah, you're right. We've got to own that, especially as women, especially individuals who are sort of in minority positions, because as we know, if a young person doesn't see somebody who looks like them doing the thing, they don't think the thing is for them.
Right. Yeah. And I should also just clarify, just for those women that did write those essays, that, some of them were probably pushed into those positions of doing other things because the opportunities that were in academia were so limited. And
and
So
or like
then they,
not survivable. Like, why would I kill
yeah,
myself and wait
yeah,
to have kids or wait to do all the things, whatever each person's individual situation is. Like, a
oh
lot
yeah,
of people have to really, really suffer in order to, and like, why I think a lot of younger people are waking up to the fact that like, nah,
oh
I don't
yeah.
think I want to live that way.
Well, yeah, and so then that's also sad because it's like, well, we kind of need you. I mean,
Right.
so it's not anti-academic, anti-tenure track because you do need people. You need to have a different, okay, this might sound like my crazy soapbox, but it's like that was what is academia and science is like a white male European developed thing.
Yeah,
Who says it has to be that way? Like,
exactly.
and
Like, why can't we change the culture within it so
exactly.
that it
So,
becomes a thing that people want to not like persist and survive through, but like actually thrive in and
yeah.
want to go to work?
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
On the same page. Well, gosh, I had such a great time chatting with you today. I learned a lot about fungus, and a lot of kind of my curiosities, my questions were answered. And I appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Well, I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for having
I'm
me.
glad. So, everybody, the book is Blight, Fungi and the Coming Pandemic by Dr. Emily. Is it Monosson? Am I saying it
Yep,
right?
that's
Good.
correct.
By Dr. Emily Monosson. And everybody out there listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.